Good afternoon or good morning, depending where in the world you are. My name is John Bambanek. I am the presenter for this webinar as part of the IoT Summit here at BrightTALK. Embrace the Suck, or How to Protect IoT Devices That You Can't Change. So, a little bit about myself. I am the Vice President of Security Research and Intelligence at BrightTALK, a cloud-based security company delivering firewall rules and DNS, RPZ, and threat intelligence into devices you already own. I also teach as a lecturer in the Department of Computer Science and Information Sciences at the University of Illinois. And I produce a lot of open source threat feeds based on domain generation algorithms and malware configs and the like. And I should say, to preface all of this, if you want to ask questions at any time as I'm presenting, you can go ahead and use your viewer window to ask questions, and I'll address them as we go. So, what is the Internet of Things, right? There's a lot of definitions out there. In essence, right, it's taking some traditional thing or an object, putting a computer in it, connecting it to the Internet, right, and wondering what could go wrong. A lot of devices out there, are now embedded with computers in one way, shape, or another, and connected. Behind me is an Amazon Echo, right? Where everybody knows what those are, but a lot of devices out there are now connected, and some of those are fairly transparent to us. There is a penetration testing engagement that I can think of in a military facility where they found elevators that were running, in essence, Windows XP and had vulnerabilities. So a lot of the things that we have out there today, people got a notion of, hey, if we network them, it can make our lives a lot easier, from medical devices to, smart home technology, so on and so forth, right? Which has led to a large number of security concerns as a result. Right? It is growing. There are more and more IoT devices every day. So all of your various industry analysts are talking about how many devices and how many units and revenue that could be generated, right? Nobody is on the same page. There might be 28 billion or 25 billion. It could be $7 trillion of sale or 1.2. The point is as we all know, it is a growing field and is leading to a lot of security issues and concerns, both in the enterprise and hospitals and healthcare and ICS environments, as well as for consumers and small offices. It's all around us, right? We have a wide variety of devices, and you can see in the iBleed chart of a small subset of logos, right? And we all know this is to be true because you're on this webinar, right? Of hey, this is something we now need to secure, and we need to think about it. And I know I've had several of my students also do some of their research in IoT and specific IoT devices and security. Certainly everybody remembers Charlie Miller's research in terms of hacking a Jeep Cherokee with a journalist in it, but certainly these devices all around us, right? But what are the security problems with IoT, right? And this is how I generally define what I think of as the security problem. It's basically an operating system with network connectivity that has all of the features of an operating system. Making custom OSs is hard, so usually off-the-shelf stuff is done. For a long time, it was Windows XP embedded, and there's certainly Linux versions out there. But in essence, you've got, say, the Amazon Echo behind me. It's got an entire operating system on it beyond which is strictly necessary for communicating to the Internet, processing my voice, and doing the various commands. As an example, we'll come back to this a little bit later, but the Mirai botnet was DVRs and webcams that were used in a denial of service attack because they had fully featured operating systems beyond what was necessary for just playing videos or just being a webcam. So because that is true, they're vulnerable to the same types of attacks And the problem comes in there is no real access to it, or there's very minimal access to it. I took a look at, my Amazon Echo. I know it's listening on a couple of ports, couldn't access them. It's all via an app to control it. And in that case, right, there's a lot of things you can do via the app for your Echo. But a lot of devices out there have no real access. They're full operating systems, but there's no console, there's no keyboard, there's no ability to modify the underlying operating system as a user. And as we know, certainly with consumers, but maybe a lot of enterprise environments, by and large, people aren't updating these things. So when you've got Windows XP out there running SMB v1 that's controlling your printers, your industrial printers, or the timetables at train stations, those devices have these long-running vulnerabilities out there and can be exploited, but nobody ever updates them. It's certainly a big problem in very specialized environments like healthcare, where you've got embedded devices that you can't update due to regulation and the need for certification and the strict regime those operate under. All right. Another aspect of this problem is that these devices are built by manufacturers who don't have any experience in security. They never had, right? To go back to the healthcare example, people have been building MRI machines for a good long time. And I'm sure the manufacturer out there is pretty good at it. And they say, hey, you know what? We should put a computer in this thing and network connectivity so the radiologist can see images and share them with his peers from his office without everybody having to go down to the radiology department to go take a look at the console there. Good use case. The problem is that hardening operating systems and some of those standards is completely new to them. And we all know about the talent shortage in cybersecurity, and these manufacturers are also subject to that. We're creating a huge number of security jobs that are going unfilled, and many of these manufacturers really can't compete on salary either. So this problem is going to be with us for a while unless we do things to make it a little easier on them, some of which I'll talk about a little bit later. So what could go wrong in terms of some of the attacks we've seen on IoT? I've mentioned Mirai already. It is still with us. There are hundreds of thousands of devices still infected with some version of Mirai. The original leader, I guess, who had over 90% of the Mirai infected machines has been arrested. But by and large, those devices are still out there on the internet almost a year and a half after they almost took over or took down Twitter online. So they're still vulnerable. They've never been updated or patched. Certainly there's been regulatory pressure against that manufacturer, but it's still there. And like I said, the biggest attack from there was a denial of service attack against Dyn and by extension Twitter, where it created a large disruption into that service around Christmas in 2016. As another example of ransomware, we saw with WannaCry and NotPetya and a handful of those attacks from last year, devices that we never thought of being vulnerable were infected and inoperable, right? We all know what ransomware is, generally speaking, for computers or devices that or computers that store data that gets encrypted. You have to pay the ransom. But with NotPetya and some of the other things, there was no really ability to pay the ransom because the device, you didn't have console access to the device. So you saw those, a lot of those images out there on social media and the like with the NotPetya ransomware lock screen out there at train stations, and people started photoshopping it in a variety of places. But ransomware basically bricked those devices because it wrecked the operating system. We saw with WannaCry the disruption in the healthcare environment because of the use of Windows XP, and some of those were in medical devices as well. So there wasn't data, but the functionality itself was diminished. And as we come to rely on these devices more and more, we are seeing some of the disruptive possibilities there. There is a question, I do see it, on securing legacy systems. We'll get there in a couple of slides. So I do see your question. I wanted to acknowledge that, but we're getting there. There's a lot of talk about life safety and concerns that IoT devices could have that might lead to injury or death. And there is one example I wanted to give out there, just as an idea of some of the possibilities out there and some of the things that you should be thinking of. And in this case, it's a smart light bulb. I had 2 students do research for one of my classes, just picking smart light bulbs off of Amazon. Is not the one pictured here, but it was a couple of others, saying, hey, what can you do with this? And they did, assessment, fairly weak authentication. They were able to crack into the devices easy enough and change it. One used Bluetooth, one used another protocol to manipulate and to change its settings. So you could turn the light bulb on, you can turn it off, you can change colors, you can make it blink. That one was the more interesting one to me, because then I had them test, okay, you can make this light blink. Can you make it blink at the right frequency to cause an epileptic seizure? And surely they could, doing it over Bluetooth unauthenticated. So, anybody, for as long as you can extend Bluetooth out there, you could make somebody with epilepsy have a seizure. So some of these devices, right, if there's risks of that, of those kind of things, you just shouldn't have them, right? If in a corporate environment, I'd probably argue, smart light bulbs, probably you want to be very wary of, because you have no idea who may have those medical conditions in your environment, or at least take steps to protect them. And we'll talk about some of those steps as we go. But we're certainly seeing some life safety risks. There's certainly a lot of concerns with automobiles. That research is a little bit farther down the road. The automakers are spending a lot of time and money trying to figure that out. But certainly there's a lot of devices out there that could theoretically pose a risk to somebody's safety. All right. And there's a lot of app-driven IoT devices out there that, deserve special mention. Right? There's usually some authentication to some central portal or via an application on your phone, which by extension authenticates probably to some central place somewhere out in the cloud. Things to consider about that is, what are they collecting and how they authenticate? Are there audit logs that you can get access to? There's many regulatory regimes that, talk about audit logs for sensitive things. Can that be accessed so that you can review suspicious behavior? But ultimately, it's asking a question: what happens if somebody steals this password and logs into it? What can they do with it that could harm my environment? And going through those steps. So some of those things, like I said, you should consider for app-driven IoT devices, not just in your workplace, but at your home. But certainly I wanted to segue on some of the things you can do to protect yourself from IoT devices. One of the interesting thoughts I had this morning going over this presentation as how IoT has kind of reintroduced us to some older security threats that we've either forgotten about or they're kind of taken for granted out there, right? As an example of worms with WannaCry and NotPetya and Bad Rabbit and those attacks that we saw in 2017, we hadn't really had a good worm in over a decade, to the point where, going in my class material, I was about to just take off the word worms and stop teaching vocabulary and just call it malware, because we haven't really seen those kind of network attacks. But we're introducing, right, potentially 25 billion devices out there that have operating systems that may have vulnerable libraries or services running or any number of things. And if you can access those from an unauthenticated way, the threat of worms becomes real, right? Mirai was more of a scan-based threat, but you could have very easily made Mirai into a worm where it would just keep circumnavigating the world again and again until at which point it stopped or what have you. A lot of these devices out there running Telnet, we had all but almost extinguished Telnet as a protocol transiting the internet. And a lot of these devices have, telnet listening, maybe not on port 23, but other ports that are now available out there. Again, going back to Mirai with listening to telnet on an off port using a six-digit username and password that was identical. And if you knew what port and what device, you're able to log into it and then load in Mirai into memory. So it's bringing some of these insecure protocols back, going back to manufacturers not being security conscious because they never had to be. They never had to think about these things. They start a telnet port because, I need to get diagnostic information or maybe support or whatever. I need some way to access it, so we'll just set this up. Like I said, it's a flash in the past. Because these devices can exist anywhere, right? Scanning, internet-wide scanning and IP reputation have become important again. All right, if I'm looking for the infrastructure that's trying to infect IoT devices with Mirai, well, they, by their very nature, have to be indiscriminate. So I can find them with IP reputation. If I know what those IP addresses are, I can block them on a firewall and thus protect the device, right? So we'll talk more about that here in the coming slides, right? So what are the risks, right? We've touched on it, but really in depth, you're running a full operating system, by and large, vulnerable to the same vulnerabilities that normal operating systems are, right? The difference is, you can't run antivirus or any endpoint security software or host intrusion detection. You can't do any hardening of the operating system as the user of the technology. You can't modify it, turn off services, do all the normal things you would do to Windows or a Linux server or workstation. There are no group policies for an Amazon Echo. You can't do GPOs. You can't remove, in many cases, default accounts. And patching, if it happens, you've got to go log into something and do it a wide variety of ways. You very rarely have devices out there that you could just configure to automatically update. And usually manufacturers are leery to do that because they're afraid of bricking devices because, usually the updates require flashing the firmware, not just updating the operating system. So many of these devices haven't been updated basically since they left whatever manufacturing facility they came from. So what are the threats, going from risks to threats? By and large, you're dealing with spam the earth type of actors. I want to find things that are vulnerable to this kind of device. Generally speaking, I have no idea where they exist. If I want to find the DVR that's vulnerable to Mirai or this webcam or this ICS system, you're dealing with broad scanning behavior, right? So there isn't really much in the way of targeted attacks as we would think about that today. Right? I could send a spear phishing email to somebody who I thought might be running a specific vulnerable IoT system and social engineer them to update it or to give me credentials or whatever. By and large, that is an extremely rare game with one important exception, and that's dealing with voting systems. And some of the concerns around election security. We saw it towards the end of the election cycle in 2016, some phishing emails designed to get election officials to see if they'd be vulnerable to phishing-related lures dealing with voting machines. It was kind of launched too late in the cycle for it to be a viable attack. But in that case, I know they have these devices because, freedom of information and government transparency, there are a couple of specific targeted threats. But by and large, it is the spam the earth kind of threats where they deal with quantity over quality. So ransomware as an example, and we saw that with WannaCry and Bad Rabbit, not Petya, though those weren't specifically IoT threats. We certainly see it with Mirai and worms and the like. So you're dealing with some very broad and noisy threats that generally speaking, even in network security, we might not have thought about anymore. For firewall policies, most enterprises would just simply block telnet. Well, now there might be a reason to get some of that information on what's coming in on telnet and see if those are the kind of threats that are targeting IoT devices that might be inside your organization. So, if you can't modify the device, how do you protect it, right? And this is also going into the question of securing legacy systems. If you can't touch the device and make any substantive changes to the device itself, right? There's no host protection you can do. You're left with only things that you can do on a network, right? So if you could block inbound attacks to the device or block outbound communication from the device. Many people have talked about it, and for a wide variety of reasons, they are leery to do, hey, you know what, I'm going to go block, 20 countries from my network. Some enterprises do that, many won't. But if you have a segmented network where all of your IoT devices live, you could say, you know what, my MRI machine that's got Windows XP on it never needs to talk to anybody outside the country. It probably doesn't need to talk to anybody outside the hospital, but you could do things of sort of like, why is this webcam or security system or smart meter for power grid or any number of devices, why are these communicating to OFAC or ITAR countries, right? Eastern Europe, or pick your suspicious country of choice for network traffic. You could simply just block outbound connectivity from there, so even otherwise unknown threats are blocked by the broad kind of heavy-handed blocking that you could do there. All right? Because the threat is mostly spam the earth stuff, you can use IP reputation and various feeds out there to just block known bad actors or people known to be scanning or exploiting IoT devices. And we're going to talk here in a couple of slides of how to generate that information yourself versus buying access to the intelligence, right? But here, honeypots are ideal. There's been a lot of honeypots out there for a while, and now some are talking about deception technology, which is in essence honeypots on steroids. But a lot of the conventional honeypots out there of Kippy and Cowrie and Diania and others, the need to run those has been diminished, but now IoT has kind of brought them back also. If these devices are running SSH and Telnet, and there are people scanning for these devices on SSH and Telnet, the IP reputation matters, and you can interact with those attackers to see what they're trying to download, and then block the droppers also. So going back to the point of IP reputation being important, but like I said, these devices use SSH and Telnet, and we've got honeypots for that, that you can deploy out there to start getting telemetry from these attacks to protect your network. For internet-wide telemetry, there's a lot of efforts out there to get some of that, and certainly there's open source feeds that you can get there to protect your enterprise also. But one thing I wanted to point out is DShield. I am part of the SANS Internet Storm Center. This is one of the things that we do. DShield is, in essence, a community-driven network of sensors out there on the internet that's looking at blocked network traffic, so blocked by firewalls or IDS or whatever solution out there, and then sends that telemetry back in an anonymized way to say, oh, hey, these IP addresses were involved in SSH scanning my network or doing telnet scans. It's header-based information, so it shows it on ports, and you see a report there of port 1962. I just picked one of the top 10 interesting ports. 1962 is up there. I don't actually know what that is. That could be something worth researching, as well, the attackers must, as they just started scanning the internet for port 1962. So, you could turn around and say, hey, let's go put a honeypot on that or C and start doing more in-depth research and investigations. But anyone can run one of these in their home on a Raspberry Pi or whatever device. You can run it in enterprises. Basically, you contribute logs that then get aggregated into IP addresses that are the top scanning IP addresses that you can turn around and then protect your organization and block with. So if you found a vulnerable device running on port 1962, you could generate a list of IP addresses here to block that threat from your network, inbound and outbound. But if you want to catch something targeting your organization, right? I said targeted threats are less of a thing, but they're still an area of concern in some very specific things. You can always run some of these honeypots in your own organization to start gathering information. Say somebody is looking for vulnerable smart meters that they know your company is running, so they're engaging in scanning behavior against your IP space. Well, with the modern Honey network, you can start deploying the honeypots in a fairly push-button way to start gathering that information to say, oh, okay, these are the IP addresses hitting this port, and start getting more information. Are they using specific usernames and passwords? Are they trying to download specific files from URLs, so on and so forth, so you can turn around and have more information to block with. There's a GitHub repository right there, but basically if you just Google MHN and ThreatStream, ThreatStream is another security company, but this is an open source effort that they have that allows you to basically deploy a master system to collect all the information from your honeypots. It's a collection of about a dozen or so other specific honeypots that you can run that's aggregated in one place with APIs, so you can query it and get the information more or less in real time. The reason doing this kind of work is important if you have the resources for it is there's a lot of threat intelligence firms out there you can spend money on that'll sell you feeds of data. A lot's open source, but some will charge you money. But they can't protect you against threats that are only against your organization. All of threat intelligence works by having sensors and information and access to data. And if you don't have that, then for whatever reason, you can't get intelligence based on it. So no one else is going to see attacks that are only against your organization. But if you're running honeypots, you can see that stuff in your logs, see what they're trying to do, and actually do the kind of enumeration of adversaries that a lot of security best practices tell you that you should do. Here's a couple of screenshots again for MHN. This is just the web application. I said it's fairly simple to install, but you see in there 10 recent attacks. Some are against port 445. There's some telnet in there also to give you an idea of what's going on in those sensors. So you can use whatever logic you want and say, you know what, I see these 10 IP addresses, or I should say these 10 attacks. There's, I think, 3 unique IP addresses there. You could turn around and say, hey, these are threats that I just want to block. You can query them in an API using whatever logic you want to say, okay, I'm just going to put pipeline this straight into my firewall, so now it's blocked and I don't have to worry about it until they go away or change IP addresses or whatever. I mean, IP addresses are a transferable commodity, so the scanning traffic tends to congregate in specific networks, but by and large, hey, I can change IP addresses from time to time. So it's important to time that out in your firewalls and get new stuff as you observe it. Deploying sensors is fairly simple. You click on deploy on the top. It takes you to this screen where you say you got a drop down where you can select things of which honeypot you want, and then basically, if you have an Ubuntu image, you copy and paste that in there, assuming you've got all the prereqs and there's no dependencies, then it just installs and works. And by and large, fresh installs of Ubuntu, in this case, Ubuntu 16, I've never had any issues of just running that command and then forgetting about it. So if you've got a VM farm, you could throw up a few VMs and put it in the DMZ and go to town fairly quickly. It takes moments. The reason I picked this particular sensor of Compot is that's actually an ICS honeypot. So if you wanted to simulate that kind of traffic, you could put that in there. Some of this you might want to configure if you want to do on different ports and the like. But at a very high level, it is very simple to deploy and run. You throw up a VM, or you can throw it in AWS if you want, or Azure, your cloud provider of choice, and start gathering information and intelligence about what's going on out there in terms of the threat landscape. So now you've got some IP addresses to work with and say, hey, these are scanning, right? You could block them at your firewall. Again, it's important to do inbound and outbound. And the most neglected thing, in my opinion, of network security is filtering outbound traffic. Because while there's lots of inbound threats to talk about, all malware wants to communicate to somewhere. Scanning IP addresses are a transferable commodity, but when you deal with command and control, that tends to not move as fast, or tends to be something sticky you could block on, right? There's another important detail out there, right, about IoT devices that they all use DNS to communicate by and large. So if you control DNS and can do filtering, you can control the endpoint. And that's true, in any type of environment, right, is doing DNS, having a DNS firewall, doing the filtering on your resolvers gives a lot of great ability to block threats before they're ever realized, and honestly take load off IDSs and generating all of the alerts that they can just by blocking the known stuff. So while you can't modify the device itself, it's using a DNS resolver that it probably gets through DHCP. If you're putting filtering in your DNS server, you can say, hey, when this device wants to resolve evil command and control server.com, you don't let it, or you redirect it to an internal sensor or sinkhole or whatever you want to do. So a lot of power that can be done in there with DNS as well. So what is RPZ? It stands for Response Policy Zones. It's basically a DNS firewall. So based on any of the 4 attributes of a DNS query, you could block the query, you can have it resolved to someplace else, or you can allow the query to happen and just generate a log entry, so you could do analytics or whatever you want after the fact. So, instead of getting evilbadsite.com, it could get just the query fails, it could be redirected someplace else depending on what you want to do. So it could flag on the specific query that you want, or a wildcard in a domain or a wildcard in a TLD. So if you wanted to block www.google.com, you can, or you could block everything that's in the RUTLD. You could block based on the IP address it resolves to, the authoritative name server host names that it's using, or the name server IP addresses. So lots of flexibility that you have there. And I was talking to a couple of my colleagues earlier today about this, is that if you took the 80 most abused TLDs for malware, for spam, all of the threats, if you just blocked those 80 TLDs, and it's things like .men and .click and .top, stuff that we know is just invalid, that is 2/3 of the abuse on the internet that uses DNS, just by an 80-line config in RPZ. You can whitelist specific entries, which is what we were talking about today, is, hey, I want to block these TLDs, but there's a couple of sites in there that still need to be accessible for business reasons. Well, you can do the most specific match saying, oh, I want www.google.com to work, but anything else google.com not to work, right? Very easy to do that. In terms of how the rules look in bind, this technology exists also in Windows Active Directory, though it doesn't use zone files quite like this. And so on the bottom there, you see the top half is the usual settings you have in a zone file. The bottom 6 are DGA domains, otherwise identified. So you want to block the specific domain and then anything under the domain, and that's what the dot means in that case, is just block it and make sure it just never resolves. So if somebody queries that, it just says, I can't find that domain. If it can't find the domain, the traffic never happens. You could do the same for IP addresses. So in this case, I just picked 2 net blocks that are listed by Spamhaus in their drop list, and you could block the entire net block. So anything that resolves into that whole /24, you just will never, the query will never return to the client. So obviously spam is not the threat for IoT, but as an example of how this works, let's just say you've identified bulletproof hosting providers. You could block all of their IP space and protect your IoT devices, and certainly protect a lot more than that. But this is certainly a very powerful tool that you can get to protecting those devices you can't configure, because all you've got left is network traffic and DNS. If you wanted to block name servers, same kind of concept of the name server IP addresses, right? You just use RPZ-NSDName or RPZ-NSIP. So as you see, it's fairly simple to configure. There's not much to it, but it's just immensely powerful. And really the key is getting the data into there that would allow you to block that stuff. And that's what the honeypots are for. It gives you some of that data. You can see some of the, wget or curls are trying to get for their malware and command and control to get that to work, right? As an example of another use case, in this case, you've got 6 name server domains or name server stubs. These all belong to sinkholes, so that's security researchers that are registering domains for the purposes of gathering intelligence, right? You could create an RPZ zone just for that. So protection strategies, right? You want to protect these devices. Now we talked about the building pieces of it, right? Fairly quickly at a high level. So how are you going to protect from there, right? Given your IP reputations from your honeypots, it's easy to put that into RPZs and firewalls to block stuff. The reason that it's important to do both, if you can, is you can put it in the firewall and block it, and that does end the threat if you can, if the firewall is in front of your IoT device. By putting it in DNS, you could see other aspects of that. It says, I blocked this IP address, but now I could see what domain names or host names are resolving to that IP address and get a more broad understanding of the threat. And there might be other things you want to pivot or block based off of that just in your logs. So saying you're blocking 8.8.8.8. Obviously, it's not a good IP address to block, but if you were, you could say, www.badsite.com didn't resolve because it points to 8.8.8.8. Who did that resolution and why, right? So you're gathering that more information, and you could block that domain and say, okay, and I know that badsite.com is bad guy stuff. I could block the domain also. So if he changes the IP address, your blocking stays persistent, right? Obviously you can change all the things, but as a matter of course, attackers generally don't change all of the attributes of their attack, certainly not at the same time. It's certainly important to do whitelisting, and I kind of gloss over that a little bit, but there is critical infrastructure that you always want to work, even if it's somehow identified as bad. I mentioned 8.8.8.8. If you get threat intelligence feeds, odds are you will probably see 8.8.8.8 in there. There's actually a lot of malicious domains that resolve there for whatever reason, but it's important to do some whitelisting. For DNS, it's a little bit easier, right? You pick all the domains of your critical business partners. For IP addresses, right, you want to choose your important public infrastructure infrastructure, your DNS, your authoritative DNS, your partner servers, and the like, the mail servers. You want to make sure that those never get blocked, and that's custom for every environment. So generally fairly easy to do. You could just do query frequency or in DNS, or just look at your network traffic of the most the most common 100 IP addresses used in your environment, or something rudimentary like that. Because the honeypots allow logins, you could see the commands the attacker uses. You could see their username and password. The username and password gives you an idea of what devices they're trying to get. And if you put these honeypots on there, you're going to see the same stuff, a lot of the same stuff other people do. But the interesting thing will be, what is the net new? What are you seeing that other people aren't? And that username and password gives you important information to identify it. The commands that are typing that says, oh, okay, now I'm trying to download malware from this IP address or this host name, I could block that too. And I did mention, and again, right with DNS, it's important not to block things like Google Drive and that kind of stuff. People used variations of what used to be Alexa Top 1 Million, but Umbrella and a couple others have large volumes of highly trafficked domains that you could use as a whitelist. But I made reference to it, fleeting reference to it. You could block on geography. If these devices are segmented or you've known IP space, you'd say, you know what, this smart meter doesn't need to communicate to anything other than whatever central, cloud service that you use. It doesn't need to communicate to Russia or China. That way, if something gets on that machine, it diminishes their ability to do command and control, right? Which is very, very important. You could do the same thing for firewalls. In a lot of environments, right, there's, at least in the United States, there's countries that we can't do business with. Blocking some of those countries from ever accessing a network certainly is viable, right? Doing it by TLD is kind of easy, right? But that being said, a .ru domain doesn't mean Russian. I own a .ru domain. That doesn't, mean that I'm a Russian person. You could buy a ccTLD domain anywhere. But for IP addresses, there are associated with countries. I gave you one example on the website, or on the slide here, countryipblocks.net, that allows you to select specific countries and generate firewall rules or CIDR lists, or however you want to ingest it, to say, give me all the IP addresses associated with, Djibouti, and you can get that. So lots of possibilities there if you wanted to do that and block specific countries, or even better, just allow specific IP addresses and block the rest. Whitelisting is more secure than blacklisting, but it's also more effort and energy to get those in place. So to wrap up here and then take some questions, we can't control these vulnerable devices. They come from the manufacturer. We're beholden to their update schedule and methodology, but can't really do much about the underlying vulnerable devices. You can encourage manufacturers to use the various secure operating systems made for IoT. Microsoft announced a Linux build, based off of Azure for IoT devices. There's a couple of other open source efforts to create secure operating systems for IoT. They're just not yet soup, but certainly encouraging manufacturers to go that way. But we still control the network. The network is ours. So by and large, since these are internal devices, many people have said the perimeter is dead, stop focusing on the perimeter, but for IoT devices, it's still very relevant. These devices are inside your buildings, or inside your network. Your smart meter is not going to move. My Amazon Echo is operating in the same space on my desk since I took it out of the box. These things are very much subject to perimeters, where you can do things like blocking with firewalls and response policy zones to make sure the bad things can't reach them and they can't reach out to the bad places on the internet. And one final note here of how you can help this problem. you know, is one, you can run a DShield sensor. There's a link there on the page that gets aggregated into, you know, internet-wide visibility of what's going on out there. So that data can then be derived and processed and made into better and more thorough block lists. Not just for you, but for the community at large. DShield gives this data away for free for non-commercial use. So in your company, if you're donating logs to them, and anonymized logs, you can use that the entire community's intelligence to protect your own organization, right? There are lots of connected devices out there running critical functions that may never be in an enterprise environment, right? And certainly doing our part to help protect against that. One thing I do say in a lot of my talks is, you know, security professionals, right, were rare, you know, just in the talent shortage alone. But there's a lot of technology putting out there that has risks, so making those risks known, doing what we can to make the world a little bit of a safer place. So when it comes to IoT devices, if this is an interest of yours, you want to contribute to help, there's an organization called I Am the Cavalry. You see the URL there on that slide. It's basically a volunteer organization focused on the many aspects of IoT security, from getting manufacturers educated to doing the right things to consumers and finding vulnerabilities, so on and so forth. So certainly check that out if you have interest in how you can contribute to society writ large in making the world a little bit safer from these IoT devices. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, I'll keep this open for another minute or so. Otherwise, you see my Twitter handle @Bambanek and my email address. Always happy to take questions offline as well. I hope you enjoyed this webinar, got some value out of it. I'll just pause here for questions if anybody has them before closing. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day. All right, hearing no questions, I'll go ahead and close down the webinar. Again, enjoy the rest of your day, and hope to catch you in a future webinar here at BrightTALK soon.